By the 1850s, it was very apparent that St. Paul's was going to be a Yankee church. It was on the east side of Milwaukee, not the west side of Milwaukee, so this was Juneautown. And it became a church of people who were involved in the economic community of Milwaukee. They were in businessmen, they were in law, and they eventually ended up in banking. A number of members of this congregation were on different banks in Milwaukee for a number of years. That was before the larger consolidations took place, and there were a lot of small banks in those days. So it became a congregation that could, how do I say it, exercise influence in terms of what was transpiring, not only in Milwaukee, but also within the diocese. Things that were very important to the congregation back then were missionary activities. Now, the records indicate that most of the missionary activities were directed at the Native American communities, and that included raising monies as well as putting together packets of supplies, i.e. blankets, clothing, things of that type. And so the missionary work received a lot of attention, particularly in financial reports, etc. We were also contributing to the missionary fund of the diocese, which all the churches were doing at that time. And so they had a great interest in how the diocese would spend the missionary money, and maybe they wanted to have something to say about how the diocese would spend the money. But Milwaukee was growing rapidly, and the nature of the Episcopal Church in Milwaukee was changing as well. There were new congregations, St. John's on the south side, St. James on the west side, and for a period of time, those three congregations kind of had a geographical rule. And if you lived on the east side, you had to go to St. Paul's. If you lived on the west side, you had to go to St. James. And if you lived on the south side, you had to go to St. John's. That didn't last very long, but they did it for a period of time. So those were originally considered to be missions, but they attained church status relatively quickly. Congregation continues to grow. The Civil War brings about a significant amount of change. In other words, the missionary work shifts from the Native American community to supporting the troops. And the east side of Milwaukee was called the East Side Ladies Society. There was a West Side Ladies Society, and they were very active in developing materials for hospitals, military hospitals, primarily making of bandages and other things that were needed at that point, and then shipping them out to the military that was along the Mississippi area of the Civil War. Once the war came to an end, the nature of the congregation began to change again because the industrial period of Milwaukee was starting, and we began to see a different type of growth. St. Paul's, when it incorporated, kind of expressed its desire, and it was known as St. Paul's American Protestant Episcopal Church. And at that time, the Protestant movement within the American Episcopal Church was probably the dominant one. And they began to be comfortable with that form of service, which was morning prayer, not anything else. And communion was once a month as opposed to weekly. At the time that Bishop Kemper begins to leave the diocese and Bishop Armitage is brought in, the Oxford movement had taken place in Britain and had spilled over into the Episcopal Church in the United States. And essentially that was moving away from that Protestant style of worship to a more Catholic style of worship, high church versus low church. St. Paul's had been a low church. They were essentially an anti-Catholic church in terms of that whole argument that came out that. But the rest of the congregations in the Diocese of Milwaukee moved towards what the bishop desired, which would be high church. So what that did is it left a certain amount of tension between the diocese itself and St. Paul's Church. Adding to that whole issue was the idea of having an Episcopal cathedral. St. Paul's and others saw the idea of a cathedral as far too Catholic and opposed that idea. Bishop Armitage was very much in favor of that idea. And that led to a lot of tension between the diocese and St. Paul's. And it's a tension that went on for 10 or 15 years before it was finally resolved. So over the years, people who attended the high church, and we'll use All Saints as the example of that, they started to call this church Mr. Paul's, not St. Paul's, because we were a low church. We have maintained the low church tradition for years and years, although I must admit we've kind of drifted away from the real low church to more of a medium worship. For example, we never had vestments for clergy until 1986. Kind of hard to believe that clergy, all they had was the white and the black, and that's what people wore. And morning prayer was still dominant in this church through the 1970s, although communion was now offered on a regular basis. One of the things that allowed St. Paul's to be essentially aggressive to the issue of a cathedral is that it was a wealthy congregation. You had a lot of people in this congregation who had money, to whom the diocese was depending on for some donations. It was the largest payer to the diocese for costs. Today, Bishop White called it the annual give. I always thought it was taxation, but that's what it is. But the payments that are made to the diocese in terms of your membership. And so that tension between the money and the ability to kind of go your own way because you weren't dependent upon the diocese to support you. You could do these things individually. This went so far as in terms of disagreement or kind of in your face as to ensure that the rector of St. Paul's was always paid more than the bishop. Delving into the cathedral issue, the correspondence between St. Paul's, the diocese, and more specifically the bishop. St. Paul's was not opposed to a diocese, but they were opposed to this idea of a cathedral. The original idea of Armitage is that everything centered around the cathedral. So all clergy would be employed by the cathedral. All clergy would be assigned by the cathedral. Okay, so the cathedral became more than the diocese, and it became the central influence. Well, you can understand that established rectors who were dealing with their own vestry and their church and their incomes were reluctant to jump into this thing called the cathedral. So that became the focal point of the battle of could we have a cathedral, okay? And that was the cathedral would not be in charge of everything. The diocese could be in charge organizationally, but the cathedral would not be the center of worship, the center of what we would call episcopal policy. And that was the source of the real argument. A number of things went on in here. Armitage began to identify with that group that was originally started by Richardson and had left St. Paul's. And to make it even worse, one of the things they did, once they organized as a church instead of a mission, they called themselves the Church of St. Paul rather than St. Paul's Church. And I can tell you that the members of this congregation marched to the bishop and said, you've got to resolve this. We can't put up with this. And they were thus named Trinity Church. Ultimately, Armitage, probably after the Civil War, identified that congregation as the congregation to become the cathedral. And he was able to buy the current All Saints building. That struggle continued for a number of years. So you added to that the politics of the cathedral, the politics of low church versus high church, and you had a lot of tension over the years.